And welcome to the webinar series of the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford University. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Karen Eggleston, and I serve as Deputy Director of the Asia Pacific Research Center. And before turning it over to our Southeast Asia Program Director, Dr. Donald Emmerson, to introduce today's distinguished speakers, I want to share with you an overview of the remaining events in our series on Asian politics and policy in a time of uncertainty. So you can register for forthcoming events and see recording of previous events at our website. Next week, we have an event on demographics and innovation in Asia with speakers from China, Korea, and across the region. And on March 9th, our China program hosts an event on the political economy of e-commerce in China. And now for today's webinar, I turn it over to Don.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much. And welcome to Is Indonesian Democracy in Decline? I'm glad we could get a good turnout. We have more than 400 people signed up, including what I think are quite a few Indonesians. And of course, this is more relevant to them perhaps than to any of us on the panel, at least more directly relevant. My name is Don Emmerson. I run the Southeast Asia program here at Stanford, as Karen said. Forgive me if I begin with some background that may be all too familiar to the Indonesians in the audience. Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world. 274 million people live there. It has been a democracy for more than 2 decades. In April 2019, the country held its 5th nationwide general democratic election. More than 80% of the 190 million registered voters cast their ballots at more than 800,000 polling stations run by more than 7 million volunteers. In the United States, 3 years earlier, compared with that 80% turnout in Indonesia, a mere 55% of eligible Americans bothered to vote in their national election. Having said that, of course, a liberal democracy involves more than regular elections. It requires the defense and protection of human rights and civil liberties as well. In September 2019, a conference was held at the Australian National University in Canberra. The title of the conference was a question: From Stagnation to Regression? Indonesian Democracy After 20 Years. Writing in the Jakarta Post, its former editor-in-chief, Endi Bayuni, disagreed with the conference question. Indonesia's democracy, he wrote, is not perfect, far from it, but it is wrong to describe it as stagnating or retreating. The university has essentially, that meaning the university in Australia, has essentially condemned the country as a failing state on the verge of returning to dictatorship. Whether that's a fair description of the project or not, I leave for the time being to Eve to comment on if she wishes. Anyway, Endi Bayuni continued, the conference will no doubt attract like-minded scholars, both Indonesian and non-Indonesian, to further reinforce this belief that they could, the belief that he just referred to. They couldn't be more wrong, Endi wrote. Indonesia's democracy is very much alive, but yes, it needs a bit more kick. There has been some regression in areas like human rights and guaranteeing basic freedoms, but please cut us some slack. It is testimony to Endi Bayuni's intelligence and fairness as a journalist that far from retreating into a defensively nationalist posture, he engaged the stagnation to regression question and independently concluded that yes, Indonesian democracy is indeed declining. That's a direct quote. Indonesian democracy is indeed declining. That conclusion, Endi's conclusion, opens his foreword to the conference value, which I'd like to show to the audience, and anybody who hasn't read it, and that probably many of you have not, I recommend it very highly. It's extremely stimulating and covers the topic in a thorough fashion. Quite a large number of contributors, including quite a number from about half of the contributors are from Indonesia. The book was published last year, and as you've just seen, the title retains the question mark. From stagnation to regression, question mark. In other words, it's not a flat out statement, it's a question. That said, Endi, although he has changed his mind to some extent, he remains, it's important to say, optimistic about Indonesia's future. The authors of the book differ in their judgments, but the overall conclusion that supported by the book is that Indonesian democracy is moving from stagnation to regression. And at the least, that the risks of regression are too great to ignore. Let's put it that way. But we'll see what our speakers have to say. The first is Eve Warburton, who co-edited the book with Thomas Power. Eve is a postdoctoral fellow in the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Our second speaker is Tom Pepinsky, who did not contribute the book and thus represents an outsider's view. Tom is Tisch University professor in the Department of Government at Cornell University. Their bios were included in the information that attendees could access when registering for the webinar. So to save time, I will not re-summarize their substantial and impressive qualifications to discuss the state of democracy in Indonesia. Eve, let's begin with you.
Thanks so much, Don. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you very much for introducing the book. So as Don said, the book is based, or it brings together contributors from the 2019 Indonesia Update Conference at the ANU. And back then in 2019, when we were deciding on what the theme of the conference should be, Tom Power and I decided that it really should be about the state of Indonesian democracy, because we had tracked over the preceding years a really important shift in the tone of political analysis coming from both foreign and also increasingly from Indonesian political experts. The consensus that had kind of emerged at the end of the SBY years back in 2014 was that democratic reform had all but sort of ground to a slow halt. And so Indonesia's democracy was sort of in this stagnant state. It wasn't deepening or consolidating any further, it was sort of stagnating. But when Jokowi defeated Prabowo, who we know to be this sort of neo-authoritarian populist figure back in 2014, what most experts believed was that at the very least, Jokowi would maintain or protect the status quo. And that was sort of a low quality democracy, but a pretty vibrant and competitive democracy with a vibrant media and some protections of civil liberties. But in the lead up to the 2019 presidential election, in those years leading up to it, experts were using words like deepening illiberalism, democratic erosion. In 2018, Tom Power wrote this article about Jokowi's authoritarian turn. So the language that analysts were using was changing. And so what we wanted to do with this book was to bring together experts from who have kind of a range of interests in Indonesian politics and a range of backgrounds, and ask them to identify empirically what they were seeing in these different sort of arenas of Indonesia's democracy. What were the most important instances of democratic decline and erosion? And could they also see bright spots, kind of forces for democratic progress or resistance to democratic decline? And of course, what we wanted to do as well was to try and step back and then explain why until so recently, explain why in a country that was recently or had been for 20 years almost described as this kind of beacon of democracy in Southeast Asia, why was it potentially now joining this broader global trend of democratic recession? So the book is organized into 5 parts, and each of which we anchor into comparative democratic literature in terms of kind of what the comparative literature is telling us about where the most proximate threats to global democracy are. So it opens with a comparative look at Indonesian democracy, both comparing it to its neighbors, but also comparing it to itself over time. Then we have a section on political polarization and the rise of a much more populist and sectarian form of electioneering that we've seen emerge over the last 5 years. We have chapters that look in detail at opinion polling, looking at kind of democratic support within the Indonesian population, and sort of interrogating what we know to be a sort of, a general kind of truth that the Indonesians love democracy, they support democracy, and they prefer it over authoritarianism. But we interrogate that a little bit more in parts of the book. We also have a section that looks at the key institutions that form the backbone of a healthy democracy. The representative political parties, a free and open, robust media, and the protection, of course, of civil liberties like the freedom to express one's political opinion, the freedom to organize, and the like. And in the final section, we look at what has been the politicization of key law and security institutions like the KPK, the Corruption Eradication Commission, the courts, the police. We look at the rise of non-state security actors in the form of vigilantes, and we look at trends in electoral violence as well. And based on all of these, the work of all of our contributors and on our own work as well, what Tom Power and I conclude is that across a whole range of indicators and measures, Indonesia's democracy is indeed in the midst of a serious decline. So we retain the question mark in the title, but we, spoiler alert, that's what we conclude. And I should, add, because this was mentioned in Don's introduction, by no means do we ever claim that Indonesia is on the way to becoming a failed state. And we debated that with Andy in the Jakarta Post. We wrote a sort of a response to that. And then, as Don said, Andy accepted our invitation to come to the conference to contribute to the book, and I think he sort of changed his tone as well, having read the contributions. And so just quickly, I'll just highlight some of the major sort of conclusions that we come to in the book. What we find is that Indonesia today, the Indonesian state, has become much more intolerant of dissent, of dissenting voices, of political opposition, and of open and robust criticism of the state and of the incumbent administration. So elections, as politics and elections have become more ideologically polarized, during the Jokowi years, the pluralist coalition in government, especially since the 2017 APARC crisis and the Islamist movement that brought APARC, that led to his being charged with blasphemy and the losing of the 2017 gubernatorial election. Since then, the pluralist coalition in government has viewed Islamist-linked parties and organizations as a serious political threat, and in turn has taken increasingly illiberal actions against this perceived enemy. But what we find in the book, and what research since the book has been published as well has shown, is that the state has now kind of got a very broad array, in fact, of political enemies. We're seeing an increasing willingness on the part of this administration to use laws that have been on the books for a very long time to do with defamation, especially to do with defamation, using these sorts of laws to silence student activists, to silence labor union activists, and all sorts of citizens who share unwelcome criticism of the government online or offline. They end up being increasingly targeted for harassment and even arrest. We also have a far less critical and more partisan media in Indonesia today, with the kind of the heads of the sort of major media outlets in various ways being co-opted by the administration and leaning on their editors to ensure content is not too critical. It's not like, we're not seeing the sort of thing that we see in the Philippines or in Thailand where, media outlets are being shut down completely, but instead what we've seen is this increasing tendency of the administration to kind of lean on editors and to sort of say, let's not do, especially in the COVID era. Again, this is a period of time that, these are trends outside of the book, but the book really helps explain the government's response during the COVID era, this sensitivity to criticism of its policies and the like. And then we're also seeing that kind of institutions that should perform the role of a kind of a check and balance on executive power, that their powers and their independence are being eroded. This includes the KPK, this includes the courts and the police. And so that's these are sort of the major, I guess, conclusions that the book comes to. Then we ask, where are these forces for democratic decline? Who can we sort of point to as being responsible for this erosion in the quality of Indonesia's democracy in recent years? And of course, inevitably, like in all countries, it's going to come primarily from above, from the state actors, from the political leadership. But in Indonesia, unlike, say, in countries like the Philippines or Brazil, this erosion isn't occurring in the hands of one strongman, of one sort of populist strongman leader, nor is there one strong kind of party that's responsible for that's kind of, you can kind of see as having the illiberal agenda or the anti-democratic agenda, like say the AKP in Turkey. Instead, what's going on in Indonesia is this really kind of broad cast of political actors throughout the party system seem to share this interest in a less sort of democratic and less accountable and less liberal political landscape. And there's kind of different examples we can draw on to highlight that. But one example would be the way in which the revisions to the Corruption Eradication Commission law were agreed upon very quickly by all political parties, all the major political parties, by business elites, by members of the executive, and they kind of came together to undermine that the KPK's investigative powers by revising the law, and of course to undermine its political independence as well. And so there was no real voice of resistance within the political system. There was no real kind of source of, no democratic voice, in any of the political parties or at the level of the political elite when it came to that case. And there's many other cases as well we could draw upon. But the point that we also make in the introduction to the book is that democratic regression in democracy in Indonesia isn't just threatened from above, but it's also threatened from below in some ways. So what the comparative literature tells us is that for a democracy to be sustained and for it to deepen, you don't just need state actors to protect democratic institutions and to sort of uphold democratic norms, but you need society as well. to cultivate norms of sort of tolerance, norms that support equal participation, political participation for all groups, and to protect the right of citizens to freely express their political views, their religion, their sexual preference, and the like. So you need a robust civil society and a community of people who are kind of demanding democratic government. And what certain chapters in our book demonstrate is that while Indonesians still prefer democracy over authoritarianism, in the much more polarized political context in which Indonesia finds itself today, support for particular democratic institutions is much more contingent, both within the population, but also within the civil community of civil society activists as well. So that means that, when in a polarized context, even civil society kind of can be forced to take sides and can be willing to kind of accept illiberal actions by the incumbent government if that's where they believe their interests lie, or if they fear the opposition coming to power to that extent. And so we've seen that civil society is these days, I think, less able to perform the role of a kind of democratic sort of bulwark or a bulwark against democratic erosion. And we also have, I think, new research, but also research in the book shows that support for democracy in Indonesia, while most Indonesians prefer it in the abstract, when you get into the nitty gritty and you kind of ask people about specific democratic institutions, would they support them or would they, not? A lot of that becomes contingent in a context in which there's sort of high levels of partisanship and polarization. So we sort of see Indonesia ultimately as kind of being beset from both directions. And what we haven't been able to do in the book, and this is quite concerning, is to really be able to identify a coherent or an influential sort of pro-democracy coalition. So what you would hope is that in the context where there's a serious kind of threat to Indonesia's democracy, what you get in response is, a kind of a coalition or an alliance of civil society, of pro-democracy activists with political elites, and the media, kind of coming together to defend democratic institutions when they come under threat. And we just don't really see that in contemporary Indonesia. So it's a pretty grim picture. And as I said, while we have a question mark in the title, I think that for the most part, the book paints a pretty compelling picture of democratic decline in Indonesia today.
Good. Thank you very much. Okay, Tom, it's your turn.
Thanks, Don, and thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks to Eve for those initial comments. So my task is to find something to say about Indonesian democracy that is exciting enough to sound like a disagreement with Eve, while also being faithful to my own interpretation of the status of Indonesian democracy. And what I've come down on is the view that, of course, the developments in Indonesian democracy are as troubling to me as they are to Eve, to her co-authors, the other contributors to her fine volume, and to many of you who are watching today. But that it's not clear how proximate of a problem this is in time. And this opens up the room for us to think about questions of democratic decline versus a perpetuation of a low quality democracy that may have already been there. So in the remaining time that I have, I want to try to play out some of these themes here and raise a series of questions about the status of Indonesian democracy that I think will kind of flesh out the import of that question. I'll start by doing something that perhaps nobody here is interested in hearing, and I myself am not that interested in saying it, but I do think it's important to say nevertheless, which is to say that by any measure, the progress that Indonesia has made over the course of the last half century is remarkable. And this is in no way to deny the challenges that Eve and her co-authors have identified with the state of Indonesian democracy, but at least to benchmark the state of Indonesian democracy today versus relative to the history that Indonesian democracy inherits. Democratization in Indonesia came relatively recently in world historical time. It followed 3 decades of truly strongman authoritarian rule that was inaugurated in a period of mass violence that eliminated one of the partisan groups in Indonesian politics, and set Indonesia in motion to have an essentially uncompetitive political system in anything other than the most superficial ways for a very long time. Indonesia today is not that country anymore. The legacies of that time are still with us. But I do want to emphasize that if you were to compare Indonesia of 2021 to Indonesia of 1991, the changes in levels of political competition, freedom of expression, protection for the rights of minorities, and other valuable consequences of democratic politics would be almost unrecognizable. So it's important for us to say this because it helps us to understand the benchmarks of what it is about Indonesian politics that makes it democratic and the ends to which we push it. That's all I'm going to say about benchmarking against the historical past of Indonesian politics. Now I want to benchmark Indonesian politics today, the state of Indonesian politics today, versus the state of Indonesian politics about a decade ago. Okay, and that I think is the question to which Eve and Tom's book is really responding. And that's where any number of analysts, including many of the contributors to this book, have identified real sources of weakness. I think that it's plain to see that Indonesians are more tolerant at the level of mass politics of illiberal practices by their governments or in the name of their co-partisans than would be desirable under a deepening consolidated democracy. It is not only the case that Indonesian politicians retain the legal ability to use the arms of the state to police criticism, to clamp down on opposition and others, but also a substantial number of Indonesians tolerate that. They even welcome it. I am relatively uninterested in knowing how many Indonesians respond to a question on a survey about how much do they support democracy in some abstract sense. I want to know how do they respond when the Jokowi administration disbands FPI. I want to know how do they respond when rumors that are circulating via social media lead the government to clamp down on internet access for a broader population. It's here rather than in abstract values that I think that the real danger to Indonesian democracy is visible. It is not just that the government is able to use the tools at its disposal to restrict criticism, to restrict opposition, to clamp down on the spreading of information that it deems dangerous or potentially inflammatory, but also that a substantial number of Indonesian citizens agree with this choice. And this is something which the contributors to this volume, and I should have also said, I recommend this volume to you. If you want to know about the state of Indonesian democracy, I can't think of a single other thing that would be more valuable to read than this volume. But a number of the contributions to this volume identify particular ways in which those of the Islamists and those of the pluralist orientation are eager to use the tools that are available to them and endorse the use of those tools by their co-partisans in order to restrict democratic political competition. And that is worrying. It is not simply the case that values have declined or that societies become more polarized, but that there seems to be substantial, if not majorities, but large minorities of Indonesians are willing to endorse the use of illiberal means by their governments if it serves their own political interests and their political ends. So this is a worry. How new is it? I won't claim to have the world's longest exposure to Indonesian democracy or the ability to observe its evolution since the 90s until today, because my experience in Indonesia is only in the democratic period. So I don't have personal experience prior to that. But I do know that most, if not all, of the legal means that are available to the Indonesian, to current politicians, either were available previously or were developed following the regular constitutional procedures that ought to make them legally possible. I'm thinking about changes to things like the internet technology law, which were, as far as I can tell, passed constitutionally. So even if the specific tools were not available, the constitutional framework that allows them was also there. It is also the case that the regulation of identity in Indonesia has always been something that has been subject to political oversight and control. It is simply the case that politicians in the past pick and chose the domains and the moments in which they wished to regulate identity in this way. And so many of us remember the protests, the 212 protests, the actions against APARC, and other areas in which identity has become politicized. It behooves us to remember that ever since Indonesia has been independent, it has been legitimate to regulate under Indonesian law the practice of religion, right? It is, I'm not sure how to think analytically about this question, but in a world in which politicians choose not to use the authority that is available to them, do we consider that to be less democratic, or just that we can't see the ways in which it's undemocratic, right? A lot depends on powers that are used and those that are not. And so I'm going to close my brief introductory remarks here by invoking the concept of forbearance, which is one of the key terms that you find in Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt's it's not new anymore, recent book called How Democracies Die. They make the point that democracy is not sustained by people who believe that their opponents ought to win all the time. Rather, it's sustained, the key value that's necessary is that political parties and politicians within them do not use every single tool that's available to them to pursue their interests. And I think that on both sides of the emerging Islamist versus pluralist or Islamist versus nationalist, this is a debate as old as Indonesia itself. The names change with the times, but on both sides of this axis of political conflict, we see clear evidence that partisans are unwilling to not use all the powers that are available to them to obtain their desired outcomes. And it's this sort of forbearance that I think is the essential thing that has to be reconstructed. Now, I'd also be happy to talk more, and with this, I'll close my comments. I'd be happy to talk more about other particularities of Indonesian politics that I don't think are new and that have been diagnosed by smart analysts, many of them whom were on this phone call, on this Zoom call, but have been known for a long time. The structure of the party system, the financing of political parties, the practice of collusive cross-partisan agreements in the formation of governments, and other things such as this. These are important challenges to Indonesian democracy, but they're not new. They don't seem to be novel. These are things that led people to worry about the state of Indonesian democracy in 2004 and 2009, just as much as they worry about it today. What's new, I think, and I do attribute it to, I don't know if, I don't know how to, whether to attribute this to the structure of Indonesian politics or the choices of the Jokowi administration, is the evaporation of what looks like a key form of forbearance, a decline in the willingness to not use the tools that are legally or constitutionally available or that may be developed in order to further one's political ends. I remain very optimistic about the state of Indonesian democracy. The mere fact that we can have conversations of this form is a remarkable achievement. I don't want to forget that. I also realize that's not a lot of consolation for those who are concerned about recent trends. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to you all to get your thoughts and to invite some discussion further. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tom. And if I could move the interchange forward, I think we're going to have a little bit of a trialogue here, or at least a dialogue between the two speakers before we open it up to Q&A. But there's one cue that has already come in that I'd like to share with you in the following context. the context of unintended irony. The most obvious unintended irony about this event, insofar as I am an American citizen living in the state of California, is what happened in my country on the 6th of January, where arguably a coup d'etat, you can define that in different ways. And remember, I said arguably, right? Academics love those qualifying words, took place. And so for an American to be looking at Indonesia and criticizing Indonesian democracy without having one eye focused on his or her own country would be the height of hypocrisy. So that's just an opening comment that I want to make as an American. We're not going to get into American politics. We're going to spend enough time. We don't have enough time for that. We're going to focus on Indonesia, but I think that's worth saying. And then there's another unintended irony that is more directly related to the subject of the webinar. Unlike Tom, my sort of acquaintance with Indonesia goes farther back. And I vividly remember the atmosphere. You know, we talk about the Arab Spring. What about the Indonesian Spring in 1998, 1999? I was there, not for the whole period, as were, I dare say, maybe all of the authors of the book, certainly most of them. And I remember what an exciting ferment it was at that time. Talk about optimism. Things happened more rapidly than you could have imagined. And one of the rapid things that happened was decentralization. We used to speak of, this may sound strange to some of the younger Indonesians who are on this Zoom, we used to speak of the DeKalb Mafia, the DeKalb Mafia. DeKalb is a town, a city, okay, a city in Illinois. We remember the Berkeley Mafia, you know, they supported economically through their advice, the Suharto regime. But there were graduates of Northern Illinois University with PhDs from Indonesia who went back and were participants in the most rapid decentralization, arguably, that has taken place in many countries, certainly perhaps even most countries, to my knowledge. And decentralization is part of democracy, right? Extreme centralization implies autocracy. But look at the irony, the unintended irony. What happened in part as a result of that is that certain parts of the country, I have Aceh particularly in mind, were able to establish rules, in this case, I have to be careful, versions, if you will, of Sharia, of Islamic law, in place in one of the provinces of Indonesia, which raises dramatic questions about the viability of democracy, at least in that one part of the country. So it's possible, and there are other examples I could point to. And I wonder, just on that one issue of decentralization, bestowing power and authority on regional governments that may behave in ways that actually, in some respects, even abrogate the national commitment to democracy. Is that an argument worth making? Would either one of you want to comment?
So the irony of, I mean, it's hard to say because the quality of Indonesia's democracy at the local level has always been, you know, low as well. We know that, you know, elections at the local level, while in some places are very, very vibrant, very competitive, and we know that local elections have produced what Indonesians see as sort of reformist, kind of technocratic, hardworking politicians like Jokowi, which is how he was seen, you know, when he was mayor of Solo and governor of Jakarta. You know, so there's that kind of, the decentralization has sort of done its job in some ways. But in other parts of the country, you know, what you find is intense nepotism, money politics has become, and vote buying has become ubiquitous all around the country at all sorts of elections. At the local level, you see a lot of, you know, sort of corrupt alliances between incumbent administrations and local security forces. So, you know, decentralization was is, I think, one of the most critical aspects, obviously, of Indonesia's democratic transition, and remains, you know, a very critical part of its democracy. But just like at the national level, its quality has always been, and this was the point that Tom was making, that it has always suffered from a whole kind of range of pathologies. And I guess the question the book is trying to answer, while we don't look at decentralization specifically, is, you know, have we moved from kind of a stagnant, low quality democracy to something else? And I'll just sort of try now and relate back to Tom's point about benchmarks, because it's an important point. You know, when you ask, well, what is the state of Indonesian democracy today? It always depends on, well, compared to what? And the argument that, if we compare Indonesia to itself 20 years ago, it looks a lot better. Well, of course, I mean, no one, I think, can disagree with that. But the danger in relying on those sorts of benchmarks, comparing Indonesia to 20 years ago or 30 years ago, or comparing Indonesia to Myanmar, or comparing Indonesia, to even Thailand and places like this, is that we risk understating the importance of these micro cases of erosion. What we know from the comparative literature is that a lot of democratic recession or regression, whatever term you want to use, is occurring at the hands of elected politicians who continue to normatively support democratic institutions and elections, but in reality are chipping away at fundamental democratic institutions and norms in small, micro ways. And it's very important to, I think, also look at sort of smaller time benchmarks, and to be very sensitive to the ways in which these sort of micro processes of erosion, these slow and steady processes of erosion, can have very serious long-term effects. There's no, in Indonesia, we don't have there's no dramatic moment of reversal like you see in Thailand. And that's very important, but it doesn't mean that the processes that we identify in the book are less insidious or are less concerning. And in fact, in some ways, and I'm now drawing on a very interesting article by Mark Thompson in Democratization recently, where he points out that in fact, when you have these dramatic moments of reversal, like in Thailand, that delegitimizes the elites, and you get a kind of stronger movement to try and resist that democratic erosion. You kind of have a stronger pro-democracy kind of response. In places like Indonesia and the Philippines, where erosion is slower, less easily identified, less dramatic, in fact, you don't get as much resistance to that process. And so I would that would be my kind of response to the benchmark comment as well. I'll stop there and let Tom speak.
Okay, Tom, let me just introduce another question. Thank you very much for that, Eve. And this is related to the issue of Islamism in Indonesia. As I read the critiques against Indonesian democracy for not defending individual rights and liberties sufficiently, there is perhaps an inclination on the part of some of the authors to include as necessary to protect organizations in Indonesia that are anti-democratic. Now, the issue of FPI, the Front Pembela Islam, for any Americans who are not familiar with the abbreviation, the Islamic Defenders Front has been banned. And so just on the surface, without knowing what the Islamic Defenders Front is about and what it wants to do, one could say as a small d Democrat, that's a bad thing. You shouldn't ban, right? But on the other hand, if we look at the program that FBI offers to Indonesia, which is essentially the Sharianization of the entire country, at least the Muslims throughout the country, okay, maybe not the Christians, but the Muslims, and given that they have such a huge majority, that would certainly affect the tenor of the state and would violate the Pancasila notion of pluralism at the national level. And I remember there's an interesting item in the book. Marcus Mietzner, in his chapter, refers to a survey that was done in 2017, in which a 13% sample of Muslims in Indonesia agreed that if FPI were a political party, they would vote for that party. They would vote for that party. Now, if we project that, do a little political science fiction and imagine that the FPI were a legal political party in Indonesia, that would mean that FPI would be the 4th largest party in the entire country. And this is a party predicated on the notion that Pancasila is wrong because it's too tolerant. It incorporates, it's too intolerant of Islam in the sense that they believe that they are somehow, they are the aggrieved party because Sharia is not recognized, at least not nationally, in Indonesia. And so why would it be that a Democrat, a small d Democrat, would not say banning FPI is a good thing because this is an enemy of democracy? We have this problem here in the United States at the moment. There are elements of political elements in this country that are dead set against democracy, arguably part of the Republican Party. The Trumpism that still exists at the grassroots level is a danger to American democracy. So what does that say about the recommendation of a more democratic Indonesia, which would focus so heavily on the rights of individuals, regardless of what they profess? Let's start with you, Tom.
So that's a great question, Don. It gets at a core tension in democratic theory, which I will not probably resolve here, about, must liberals tolerate illiberalism, or does democracy require that we tolerate the intolerant? I do want to say on your comments about January 6th, as an American, it's been a rough couple of years in terms of democratic backsliding and regression here. But I don't hold the view that our last president was himself responsible for it. I have a sort of more New Testament interpretation that he fulfills processes that were set in train a long time ago. And we can talk about whether or not the original sin is Reconstruction, Lyndon Baines Johnson lying about the Gulf of Tonkin, or Newt Gingrich, but it doesn't start with Trump.
No, I didn't mean to say it would.
No. But this is relevant though, because it is exactly a sort of more sort of long-term view that I want to invite us to have, that the origins of the choices that are being made by today's politicians must be understood with reference to the situations, the tools that they've inherited, right? Jokowi has not seized power and made choices that were not available to him. He has chosen in ways that I don't support. But let's get back to your question about FPE. In my interpretation, FPE is a criminal organization that has wrapped itself in an identitarian banner. My preference would be to use the law that exists in Indonesia for the regulation of criminal activities to prosecute FPE as a criminal organization. And if it's found to be in violation of existing laws, for it to be disbanded on those grounds, and the members who are currently or in the past having had been engaged in acts of violence or acts of corruption or mayhem or anything like this, to be jailed on those reasons. I am fully aware why that is hard in Indonesia right now. I am fully aware of the fact that the Jokowi administration probably does not trust the country's legal system to achieve that outcome. And perhaps that is why he and his supporters believe that that simply banning the organization for violating or being in contradiction with the country's broader constitutional framework is the appropriate direction. And although this is not the choice that I would make, it could be that he's right. It could be that this is the way this is the least bad option for protecting liberalism and democracy in Indonesia. But I don't think that it is. And the reason is because it gives, I believe that, in point of fact, as a matter of practical politics, it helps the movement and the extreme ideas that underlie it more than it does interrupt them. So I believe it to be a tactical mistake. As to the broader question of what you do when there's an organization such as this, which purports to command roughly 13% of the popular votes in a democratic election, what I would prefer to see is FPE to try to become a political party, try to actually act as this, and for it to be treated as the pariah political party that it would be, for holding views that when shown on the billboards, on television in front of everybody, would not be as popular as it is as a shadowy organization, which doesn't have to be responsible for any actual policy implementation. So that's my view.
Good. Eve, would you like to comment?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it is obviously a dilemma that all democracies face in terms of how a democracy that protects the right of citizens to individual thought, to political expression, how you protect those rights when there are certain groups in society that hold very illiberal, anti-democratic political views and engage in sort of anti-democratic activities. But I think there's the difference with what's taken place in Indonesia in recent years, not just with FPI, but also HTI, Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia, is the way in which the government has gone about banning these Islamist institutions and some of the reasons why, their motivations for doing it, I think very problematic, because Indonesia already had on the through existing laws a way of banning organizations that were anti-Pancasila, anti-state, and that were threatening, and of course, as Tom pointed out, that engage in violent criminal activities. And that these weren't the tools that were used by the Jokowi government. Instead, Jokowi introduced this a different rule, the Perpu Ormas, which basically gave the executive power to disband these sorts of organizations without going through the proper process, which was to have a legal and to have a court sort of hear the case and look at the legal grounds of banning such an organization. So by circumventing legal process, what the government has done is given itself a tool, and I'm quoting here Usman Hamid and Liam Gammon, a kind of a tool for repression, because they can ban organizations that they deem to be anti-Pancasila, and that's quite a kind of loose sort of, way of defining, or it's a loosely defined concept. And what's really quite remarkable is that in the process of banning these sorts of organizations and the way the government has gone about attacking other sorts of Islamist political groups and individuals is not using the language of defense of liberal democracy and liberal norms and the like. It's all about defending Pancasila. And, Don, I'm sure this is something that, people who have watched Indonesian politics for decades, it bears this uncanny resemblance to the way that the Suharto government justified the banning and the repression of certain groups. And I would encourage people who are interested in kind of this sort of problem, and in particular the way in which the Jokowi government has gone about handling Islamist threats, to read Greg Feely's work, where he gives, I think, a very eloquent explanation as to kind of, what is the democratic way of handling sort of illiberal but ideologically rooted Islamist threats in a Muslim majority country. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Here's a question from Alex Arifianto at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. He writes, one enduring feature of Indonesian politics that endures in different time and political regimes in Indonesian history is the endurance of a leader's personality and clientelism. Arguably, this is one feature that has weakened different political institutions who are supposed to check and balance any Indonesian ruling regime. My question, why do you think personalism and clientelism endure in Indonesian politics? And how do you think they have affected the erosion of Indonesian democracy that we have seen in recent years?
That's a big question. Why does clientelism endure? It's probably a question for Burhanuddin Muhtadi, who's done excellent work on sort of vote buying, clientelist networks and local politics in Indonesia. There's little doubt, I think, that clientelism and corruption continue to be a major challenge and a leading cause, in fact, of some of the problems Indonesia's democracy faces. The way that the political competition is sort of structured in Indonesia is through clientelist networks. Some of them are kind of rooted through social organizations at the local level, and that the way in which politicians are connected to their voters is kind of through the clientelist networks that involve a whole range of kind of social and religious organizations. The cost of politics in Indonesia is extraordinarily high. So the state doesn't provide subsidies to political parties. Political parties need to sort of raise their own funds to pay for elections. And inevitably what that means is they lean on they look for candidates that can pay for their own electoral campaigns. So what we've seen over the period of time is that the kinds of people that are getting into politics at the local level and who lead parties at the national level are people with private sector backgrounds, people who are coming from activist backgrounds, academia, certainly labor unions. All of that is very, very rare and increasingly so. So you're either getting bureaucrats or you're getting, business people into politics in Indonesia. And so that has sort of long-term consequences for the kind of representativeness and the kind of quality of political candidates that are coming through the ranks, within Indonesian politics. So that's one way you can kind of see that that clientelism and the role that money plays in the Indonesian party system is sort of chipping away at kind of the representativeness of politics over time. And then, of course, even, you know, within parties as well, what that means is that the people who have the money are the ones that can kind of influence elections internally within parties. And I'd encourage people to read Marcus Mietzner's chapter on this in the book, where he sort of documents how over time the quality of the Indonesia's political parties has really deteriorated. And he looks specifically at party financing, at money politics, and also on the kind of the role that oligarchs and wealthy individuals play increasingly in Indonesian parties. So yeah, that's one way to look at it. We could talk about that for a whole other, you know, for a lot longer.
Before I pass it to Tom, let me add a question, if I could. It's an abstract question, but then we're academics and we're all guilty, I suppose, from time to time of being a little bit too abstract. The question is this: it actually applies to the United States as well as to Indonesia. And the question is, if you consider the state of democracy in Indonesia, just as one might the state of democracy in the United States, and you are emphasizing the negative aspects, to what extent would you explain those aspects on structural grounds, that there are structural reasons why, let's put it this way, Indonesian democracy is not performing up to what it could do or what it could be? And to what extent do they involve personality, the leader, Donald Trump, Jokowi, so that if you change the leader, the structure will follow suit, right? Or must you change the structure first, hoping that it will generate a better leader? Tom, how would you respond to that question? And you can answer anything, other questions that may be on your mind. I'm being a little bit dictatorial. I'm not being very democratic by kind of forcing these questions on the table, but they do reflect some of the questions in the Q&A. Tom?
Yes. So I'll answer that question, and then I'll get to some of Alex's questions, and they're related. So I do recognize that in the end, politicians make their own choices, and that politicians are, you know, they are not compelled to do any particular thing inexorably by the force of history and structure. But I don't count on politicians to do pro-democratic things or well-meaning things. My analytical orientation is always going to be more towards looking to the structural explanations for things. So when tools are available, I suspect that they will probably be used. And when legal means can be devised following constitutional procedures or the existing mechanics of government, I suspect that they probably will be. And the solution is not to wait for a politician who just won't do those things, but the solution is to change those structures. That is my pessimist's view on this question. To return to Alex's question, let me offer some very brief structural interpretation of those two questions. One is, you know, the role of personality in Indonesian politics. I don't think that it is any larger in Indonesia than in any other presidential democracy or semi-presidential democracy. I don't know this for sure, but I don't get the sense that Indonesia is unusually focused on the identities and personalities of its chief executives relative to any other presidential system that I'm familiar with. And this can be, Emmanuel Macron naming his political party after his own initials, or Barack Obama being viewed as the solution to all of America's problems, and then being replaced by somebody like Donald Trump, who does the exact same thing. And so I think the structure of Indonesian politics kind of impels us to attribute a lot of meaning to the identity of the president. And there are certainly some unique features of Indonesian politics that maybe encourage Indonesians to think about their executives in particular ways. You know, the legacy of the common Javanese heritage of nearly every elected president, and the history of the independence movement. But I think that it's not that abnormal and not that unusual. As to the persistence of clientelism, without being flip, a resource-wealthy post-colonial country with a large and overdeveloped state and weak political system, weak party system for half a century, is unlikely to be able to develop the type of state institutions that can organize programmatic policies or organize policies in a programmatic way. And so all the endowments that Indonesia enjoys as legacies of its colonial history, its geographic and natural resource endowments, militate against having a really strong programmatic focus. And then some of the only programmatic parties that exist in Indonesia are either destroyed or illegal, right? So two programmatic views that you can have are something like a radical socialist agenda or an Islamist one. And those things are incompatible we can debate if there are good reasons or not with the structure of Indonesian politics under the 45 Constitution. And so those groups that have the strongest ability to be programmatic are the extremists, and they don't exist.
Okay. Eve, when I turn to you, forgive me, I'm just going to put another question on the table. Feel free to ignore any of these questions, given the limited time that we have available, but I'm reflecting some of the concerns expressed in the Q&A from the audience. How would you factor in two elements? One is corruption, and the other is poverty, into an explanation of what you and your co-authors, at least, consider to be the shortcomings of Indonesian democracy. And these are arguably structural elements, which Tom emphasized, and that's one reason that I'm passing that emphasis on to you. Could you comment?
Sure. Okay, I will come to that as sort of part of the answer to the broader question which you posed, which is that sort of structure versus agency, question, which inevitably we can never sort of say it's either or when we're trying to explain political phenomena. It's always a sort of mix of the two, right? And I think that, we can look back at some of the sort of seminal explanations for Indonesia's democratic transition that were written by people like Ed Aspinall, his piece on the irony of success, right? That Indonesia, one of the reasons that Indonesia's democratic transition was sort of so successful and didn't experience an authoritarian reversal in that first decade is because what replaced authoritarianism was a very low quality democracy, one that kind of built into the system spoilers, whether they're kind of conservative military elites, all the sorts of, whether it was sort of separatists in Aceh or whatever, there were kind of all these sorts of conservative figures and elements that were kind of given a piece of the democratic pie. And the consequence of that was that you have a democracy, but you have not a sort of a radically liberal democracy, kind of a low quality democracy. And this relates back to the point that Tom made at the very beginning, which is that, Indonesia's democracy has really been tested in various ways and challenged by reactionary elites sort of from the beginning. What I think has changed though, and so we know that Indonesian institutions are relatively weak, and that they are constantly kind of being challenged and revised. And one example would be, just to make it more sort of more concrete, would be the KPK. So the KPK is sort of one of the major achievements of the democratic of Reformasi. But from day one, many within the political parties, within the elite, saw it as a major threat, and the police as well, and experienced a series of attacks on it. And SBY during those years felt as though it was his role to kind of protect it. That it was given its intense popularity, it was he ended up falling on the side of the citizens and of the NGOs and protected it from the attacks from the elites and from the police. And things have changed, and I think that's where you do have to look at agency as well. So what we're seeing, I think, during the Jokowi administration is a much more serious attempt to test the strength of Indonesia's democratic institutions, and we're seeing that indeed that they can be that these kind of illiberal tools that have been there and available for use for many years, like the laws on defamation and blasphemy. We're seeing them used much. We've got an administration and a president who are clearly much more willing to use them. And I'm probably repeating myself a bit here, but the political context has changed. We're now in a situation where Indonesia is more ideologically polarized, where the major party in power is PDIP, the most ideologically pluralist party, within the party system. We have an incumbent coalition that sees the stakes as being much higher. They have identified a political enemy, which is PKS, and the Islamist organizations that they sort of tend to affiliate, whether correctly or incorrectly, with PKS. And so when you have a situation like that, all those kind of structural weaknesses that the people have been identifying for many, many years. Now we see that what happens when you have an incumbent coalition and a president who are now see a benefit, indeed a need, to kind of use some of those illiberal tools, or to kind of erode institutions that were never very strong in the first place. And so it's that mix of structure and agency, I think. And Jokowi, while we obviously can't blame him personally for all the kinds of illiberal, all the sorts of problems we've identified in the book and elsewhere, he is a very different kind of president to SBY, and I think he is shows very shallow commitment to democratic norms and institutions, and he's very determined. He's a very kind of narrow focus and a narrow understanding of what it means to govern, of what governance is. For him, governance is about service delivery. It's not about kind of law, legal protections, liberal rights, and all these sorts of things. And he's even said that explicitly. And where SBY was much more philosophical about kind of democracy and his role as the kind of the president who transitioned Indonesia, and who brought Indonesia to its kind of to this sort of vibrant democratic polity that it was, in the early 2000s. So I think, I would emphasize, both those structural elements, but also the way in which political actors in power now are responding to the kind of political landscape that they find themselves in.
A very broad question from Riana Astuti of the Consulate General in San Francisco, the Indonesian Consulate General. She asks, how do you think the best way is to educate people that they are free to express their opinions, yet they also have the obligation to respect other people's viewpoints?
How do we teach people anywhere, not just in Indonesia, that they have the right to voice their opinions and the responsibility to respect those of others? I struggle with that within my own family, with my children. This is a tough thing, and I don't mean to say that to trivialize it. Just to say that this is a challenge that has to be met at multiple scales, and certainly isn't unique to Indonesia. I think that the single most important thing that a government can do is to practice what it preaches, which is to support, nurture the free expression of dissenting ideas, to hold up as valid those who do criticize official narratives, and then to ensure that criticism, free expression does not translate into incitement or violence. This is something that the Jokowi administration is able to do and has done at various points. But I see no other way to inculcate that as a value in society than to lead by example and to almost demonstrate that this is the way to be.
Okay, two questions. One from my colleague, Tom Finger. Would either of the panelists be willing to compare what Tom calls the pillars of Indonesian democracy, the supporting structures of Indonesian democracy, if we can put it that way, to identify the most important, or if I may tweak his question a little bit, if you were to start, accepting the notion that Indonesian democracy could improve, which I think is perhaps something many of us would accept, if not perhaps all of us, where would you begin? Which pillar, which support item, which aspect would you start on that would have the maximum effect on improving Indonesian democracy? And the second question is a very interesting one and very timely in the light of, well, I won't go into the details, but let's put it this way, the conceivable familial ambitions of Jokowi with regard to his children. Do you think that political dynasty is on the rise in Indonesia, both locally and at the national level? This is from an Indonesian observer.
I think the question is sort of, which institution would you pick if you wanted to strengthen Indonesia's democracy? I mean, it's sort of a hard question to answer, right? I think in the short term, what I think rights activists and political analysts have been most concerned about, sort of where we've seen a sort of the quality of democracy declined at a real pace has been the protection of rights for political expression, open criticism of the government. And I think that if you wanted to kind of try and strengthen one kind of key pillar of democracy in Indonesia to have a sort of immediate short-term effect, it would be to reverse that trend, in an ideal world. I'm not talking about how possible that would be. And then I think sort of longer term, the kinds of institutional changes that would hopefully make a real difference to the quality of Indonesia's democracy would probably be within the party system, and trying to ensure greater representation of throughout the party system. So that could be through changing the financing system so that you have all sorts of different people coming into political parties from a wider range of backgrounds, but then also, and this is obviously debatable, there are arguments for and against on both sides. But I think increasingly people argue that if you lower the threshold for parties to be able to enter parliament, and then you would have to run for parties to be able to be set up and to run, because it's very hard at the moment to set up a party in Indonesia and for it to get into parliament. And then you would have all different sorts of political parties. You wouldn't just have parties that are kind of catch-all, personalistic kind of vehicles for people like Prabowo, Surya Paloh, and wealthy oligarchs. But you could have parties that, represent labor rights, or that perhaps have a more progressive agenda, or yes, you would have kind of more Islamist parties as well, but then you would have them expressing their views through the political system rather than outside of it. So I think there's you could have kind of short-term goals, like what's happening now that we could try and arrest, that would improve the quality of democracy in one way, and then you could have sort of longer term, and these are the sorts of things that Indonesians and political analysts and technocrats within Indonesia have been, debating for a very long time, obviously.
There is a risk of majoritarian rule, but there's also a risk of minoritarian rule. If you lower the threshold and you have, a cacophony of tiny parties, each with a very narrow, and arguably, if they're led by a tycoon who wants to use the party exclusively to increase his annual income, very parochial interests represented in a fragmented parliament that cannot act on behalf of the public interest, which requires amalgamation, integration across all the private interests of individual political actors. And that this actually would also move in the opposite direction of more programmatic parties dealing with national issues. It would go down to more venal issues, perhaps, on the priorities of relatively corrupt individuals that can afford to start a political party mainly to help their own careers. So is there an optimal in-between that you search for? Do you pick a particular province as an experiment? I think that would probably not work, politically not feasible. How do you balance between those two risks?
I mean, Tom might want to step in here as well and maybe draw some comparative examples. But I mean, it's as I said, there are kind of really legitimate arguments on both sides, I think, when it comes to these sorts of debates. But I guess, what we have already in the Indonesian party system is, you have the parties that have an established ideological kind of base, the PDIPs, the PKSs, the PKBs, but then all the others really, and the new parties that were established after the fall of Suharto are precisely what you just described. In fact, these are parties that were set up for the economic interests and the personal ambitions of oligarchs and wealthy business elites. And it's basically been impossible for any other sort of party to emerge, which I guess is the argument for making it easier for people to start parties. Yes, you get a high level of fragmentation, but as it stands currently, the Indonesian party system has gradually become, I think, less representative. And so I think, restructuring the party system would, I think, create opportunities for change in that regard. And I think, again, some radical changes around party financing as well, so that kind of the way in which which forces parties to kind of go and seek out wealthy individuals from the local to the national level. Of course, as I said, these are people have been debating these issues within Indonesia for a very long time, and of course the open list and closed list debate as well. But you have to have political elites interested and in making these sorts of changes. And at the moment, the incumbent administration and this very large coalition, I think, don't have an interest, and the big parties don't have an interest in creating a more competitive landscape. In fact, they're trying to work towards the opposite. And that would, and if it becomes less competitive, it's the smaller parties like PKS that drop out. And then you have a situation where that kind of the legitimate sort of, need for representation of conservative Islamist voices is no longer possible. So yeah.
I'll say one final thing in this set of comments, and that's to respond to Eve's comments about, what if you just lowered the threshold to allow there to be more parties that would form. I think that I share Eve's view that this would address some of the concerns about not enough political compensation, not enough opportunities for new voices to enter politics and to represent things rather than people, or Indonesian tycoons and billionaires and things like this. However, I don't know how much lower that threshold can go without running into the possibility of running afoul of the desire of having parties that actually represent the entire geographic space of Indonesia. So like if we're looking at parties that are much smaller, could they also feasibly cover Indonesia in the way that we hope that they do? One of the big challenges that the moment of democratization was designed to address was the possibility of regional parties emerging that have non-national aspirations and use their ability to enter national politics to prosecute what are essentially provincial territorial aims. And there's lots of different details about the democratization process that made that difficult, and I think stamped it. One of the greatest successes of institutional engineering is making sure that was basically impossible in Indonesian democracy. I don't know how much lower you could go in terms of the threshold and still have functional political parties that would not be essentially regional parties in some fashion, which would incentivize them to lie about their national scope, which is not something we want to do either. But anyway, that's just something that emerged as I was thinking about what are the trade-offs we might want to weigh in that one. And that's one, again, getting away from the Jakarta focus of most of today's comments to think about how that interacts with the spatial heterogeneity of this very complex country.
I think at this point, we're pretty much getting close to the end here. Maybe I could ask each of you to sort of wrap up in a few minutes any things that you feel were not said that should have been said, or ideas that occurred to you now to add to the stew that we're cooking. And let me start with, if you could, Tom, could you go first, and then I'll ask Eve.
Sure. I'll just respond quickly on COVID. It's been a very pleasant hour and a half for me because I haven't thought about COVID once. Here in the U.S., things are tough, and it's been hard to see our low quality democracy struggle administratively to manage an effective response. One of the consequences of being stuck here is that I found it very difficult to follow over the past 12 months, even more than I do normally from afar, events on the ground in Jakarta. And so I don't want to just skip COVID, but I do want to suggest that I probably don't know as much about how to interpret things properly or what the latest things are, the latest state of affairs are. I have been struck, however, by some of the things that I've seen, which is I think that COVID is very different from, say, the Asian financial crisis of the late 90s, in which it doesn't generate the same sort of distributional conflict over what to do about it that you might imagine. And I've been struck by how tolerant Indonesians have been of their elected leaders, even given the opposition that has existed, because my interpretation is the leadership has been quite poor. And it's straight. I don't have any more insightful things to say than that, except for to say that I do find that striking, that there has not been more of a punishment. There seems to be relative tolerance for what I think is fairly poor performance.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. Eve, would you like to comment, wrap up?
I think it makes me a little bit anxious to sort of argue that you know, Indonesia, which we know has had a very poor response to COVID. There's no second or third wave. It's just one big wave of COVID, and the hospitals in the major urban centers are full, and it's devastating, really. And the question of whether, you know, what could have been done better, you know, is it that we should have had a much stronger executive with the capacity to kind of unroll its policies and its, you know, more effectively throughout the regions? You know, what you need is more centralization of power. Now, I don't think that's the answer in Indonesia. In fact, the opposite is probably true, because from the early days, what we had is actually some governors trying very hard to implement lockdowns and to implement clear regulations and instructions, and we had resistance from the central government. So it's sort of, if we'd had the central government perhaps in complete control, things could even have been worse. So it's not that, you know, I don't think that there's a kind of, that strong centralized rule is what it leads to a better COVID response. I think what would have led to a better COVID response is better communication between the central and local governments, but also it's really about the effectiveness of the bureaucracy at the local level as well, and the health infrastructure. And Indonesia has a sort of a woefully underfunded and poor kind of health infrastructure, and it has a situation where local and central governments haven't been on the same side and haven't necessarily been following the same sort of approach to how to contain the virus. And I think that's you know, that's the key. It's not that we should be handing more and unchecked power to the central government. It's that the lines of communication were poor. The central government itself was in denial from the beginning about the seriousness, and continues to be very skeptical of lockdowns and the like. And also just the health infrastructure, of course, in Indonesia was poor from the beginning, but it hasn't been utilized effectively, I think, by the central government.
Thank you so much, both of you, for taking the time, for sharing your ideas, your thoughts. Thank you, Eve, for co-editing the book. I wish I could have your co-editor and all of the authors together. That would have unfortunately been unwieldy, but I appreciate it very much, and I wish you all the very best.